Un minuto ancora. Un minuto ancora. Buon pomeriggio, benvenuti. Welcome to all of you, also those who are following us in streaming. The purpose of today's meeting is to create a space in our minds and in our hearts to receive the harvest of a very long and delicate process, which has meant ecumenical synergy and a chain of authentic dialogue. John Paul II, in Utunum Sint, addressed the key question: how can the ministry of the Bishop of Rome become acceptable to all Christians? Christians responded. And today we present the response to the responses. It is a momentum which calls for responsible commitment and to joy. We are honored by the presence of distinguished guests as His Excellency Archbishop Michael Jalach, Secretary of the Congregation for Oriental Churches. Thank you for your presence, Excellency. We are grateful for the presence of the academic authorities of this institution, and I would like to ask the Dean of the Faculty of Theology of this Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas in Rome, Professor Dominik Jurczak, to address us with a word of welcome. Thank you, Professor.
Buon pomeriggio a tutti. So let me welcome you here in this university, in this faculty. And I'm very happy that the Institute for the Ecumenical Studies, which is linked, which is a part of the Faculty of Theology, is organizing this conference. And one of our hope is to find and to enter into the dialogue and to understand what does it mean for us. Also, the place is very particular because normally in that aula we do our defenses of the doctorates. It's also the place where we have, where John Paul II, as a student, he defended his doctorate. So it is a very particular place also for this conference, for this presentation. So let me welcome you and encourage you for the discussion and to look and for looking for the truth in our faith.
Thank you, Professor Jurczak. The document is structured into 4 parts. The first part is an ecumenical reflection on the ministry of the Bishop of Rome. The second part presents the fundamental theological questions. The third part provides perspectives for a ministry of unity in a reunited church. The fourth part focuses on practical suggestions or requests addressed to the Catholic Church by the responses. This afternoon, we will follow the structure of the document, so we will have 4 brief presentations mirroring the various chapters of the document. Then we will have contributions from the Orthodox and Anglican perspectives, and then there will be a time for question and answers at the end. So I would say to start with the first presentation by Reverend Professor Hyacinthe Destivelle, Dominican from the Angelicum, founder and director of the Ecumenical Institute of the Angelicum, now responsible for the dialogues and relations with the Oriental Orthodox churches. He's also very much involved in what we call cultural ecumenism, especially with the Eastern Orthodox churches. He's editor of Acta Ecumenica, and together with Monsignor Usma, is also the liaison person of the Dicastery to the synodal process. He will present us the second chapter of the document, the key theological issues. Professor Destivelle.
Thank you, Professoressa Rossi. First, I would like to say that this document has has been drafted in collaboration with the Institute for Ecumenical Studies, as it is said in the preface by Cardinal Koch. So I'm very pleased that we are able together this evening with the team of the Ecumenical Institute, the Ecumenicum, to to present this document from a theological and ecumenical point of view. So after a first chapter presenting the responses to Ut Unum Sint, and also the documents of theological dialogues on primacy, this document just published today and was presented in the Sala Stampa of the Holy See this morning. This text dedicates a second chapter to the main theological questions traditionally challenging papal primacy. And the document identifies 4 fundamental theological questions which are generally addressed. First, scriptural foundations of the Petrine primacy ministry, the question of the Iure Divino, that is, foundation by divine right of primacy. Third, the primacy of jurisdiction, and for papal infallibility. Recent theological dialogues have opened up new perspectives on these 4 questions. Firstly, the theological dialogues have enabled a new reading of the so-called Petrine text of the New Testament, texts relating to the Apostle Peter, the interpretation of which has long been a major stumbling block among Christians. While Catholics have traditionally based the papal ministry on these texts, Orthodox and Protestants have challenged this Catholic interpretation. However, on the basis of contemporary exegesis and patristic research, new perspectives have been opened up, calling into question certain traditional confessional anachronistic projections of later doctrinal developments. And these new insights have helped to reconsider Peter's role among the apostles. A second controversial issue is the Catholic understanding of the primacy of the Bishop of Rome as being established by divine right, de iure divino, whereas most other Christians understand primacy as being instituted simply by human right, de iure humano. Hermeneutical clarifications have made it possible to put this traditional dichotomy into new perspective, replacing the distinction between de iure divino and de iure humano. The dialogues have instead emphasized the distinction between the theological essence and the historical contingency of primacy. As John Paul II did actually in Ut Unum Sint by distinguishing the form of exercise of primacy from the essence of its mission, the form and the essence. On this basis, the theological dialogues call for greater attention to the historical context that has conditioned the exercise of the primacy. The dogmatic definitions of the First Vatican Council constitute a major obstacle for other Christians. Some ecumenical dialogues have made promising progress in undertaking a re-reading or re-reception of the Council, opening up new avenues for a more precise understanding of its teaching. This hermeneutical approach has made it possible to interpret the dogmatic declarations of Vatican I in the light of their historical context, their intention, and their reception. This methodology applies first to the dogma of universal jurisdiction. As a matter of fact, several theological dialogues have been able to clarify this dogmatic definition by studying the history of the Constitution Pastor Aeternus, and above all, the proceedings and the context of the First Vatican Council, which conditioned the choice of the terms used, such as ordinary, direct, immediate. the dialogues have been able to better define the scope and limits of the dogma of universal jurisdiction. The unofficial Farfa Sabina dialogue group was able to declare, for example, that, I quote, having examined what was in fact voted on at the council, it became obvious, to sum up, that Vatican I did not make the Pope an absolute monarch of the Church, end of quote. Similarly, certain dialogues have been able to clarify the formula of the dogma of infallibility and even to agree on certain aspects of its purpose by recognizing the need in certain circumstances for a personal exercise of the teaching ministry. In the words of the Hawkey Commission, for example, by Hawkey in 1981, I quote, although responsibility for preserving the Church from fundamental error belongs to the whole Church, it may be exercised on its behalf by a universal primate, end of quote. Of course, despite these clarifications, the dialogue still expressed concerns about the relationship of infallibility to the primacy of the gospel, the defectibility of the whole Church, the exercise of episcopal collegiality, and the need for reception. For example, speaking of Vatican I, the International Orthodox Catholic Dialogue notes in its latest document in Alexandria in 2023, I quote, such an ecclesiology of Vatican I, is for the Orthodox a serious departure from the canonical tradition of the Fathers and the ecumenical councils, because it obscures the Catholicity of each local church, end of quote.
Thank you very much, Professor Destivelle, for reminding us the importance of rereading Catholic documents as well as re-receiving some historical developments. So now we turn to the second presenter, Professor Monsignor Juan Usma Gómez, a diocesan priest from Colombia, since 2009, head of the Western section of the Dicastery for Promoting Christian Unity. He's responsible of various dialogues and such as evangelicals, Pentecostals, Baptists, Disciples of Christ, member of many international groups, responsible for relations and ecumenism for Latin America, and also liaison among the United Bible Societies and the Catholic Biblical Federation, professor here at the Angelicum. Professor Usma will present us the third chapter of the document.
Thank you very much. And the third chapter, the title of the third chapter is Perspectives for a Ministry of Unity in a Reconciled Church. Usually, the starting point when speaking of the Bishop of Rome is the division of Christians. The third chapter surprises us, describing the ministry of unity in a reconciled church. The title originally refers to an unofficial dialogue, an expression that was later used by Faith and Order Commission. The ministry of unity in a reconciled church points above all to the nature of this ministry of unity, its foundation, and the stability. There are three questions underlying in this third chapter. Is a primacy for the whole church necessary? On which basis? The second, what are the criteria of the first millennium? And the third, what are the principles for exercising primacy in the 21st century? Is the primacy necessary for the whole church? Many theological dialogues and responses to Ut Unum Sint acknowledge the need of primacy at the universal level. This is important. Referring to the apostolic tradition, some dialogues argue that from the early church, Christianity was founded on great apostolic sees in a particular order, the See of Rome being the first. On the basis of ecclesiological considerations, some dialogues have maintained that there is a mutual interdependence between primacy and synodality at every level of the church, local, regional, but also universal. Another argument, certainly not minor, is the mission in the contemporary context of globalization. Second question, what are the criteria for the first millennium? During this period, Christians from East and West lived in communion, despite certain temporary ruptures, and the structures of the church also were created. 7 criteria has been identified as points of reference and inspiration for the acceptable exercise of a ministry of unity at the universal level. That is, the principles and models of communion of the first millennium remain paradigmatic. Second, the informal and not primarily juridical nature of the expression of communion between the churches. For example, synods, liturgy, sacraments, devotions, exchange of letters. Third, the primacy of honor of the Bishop of Rome, which has never been questioned, even in times of doctrinal controversy. 4, the interdependence between the primatial and synodal dimensions of the Church as illustrated in Apostolic Canon 34. Then, the right of appeal as an expression of communion, Canons of Sardica, which could be extended to doctrinal matters, as in the case of Chalcedon. The paradigmatic character of the ecumenical councils, which raises the question of the function of the Bishop of Rome, and the diversity of ecclesial models that not necessarily be considered as a dividing issue, rather a response to different customs and needs. Let us go to the third question. What about the principles for the third millennium? The first millennium is crucial, but it should not be idealized or simply recreated. The developments of the second millennium cannot be ignored, and a primacy at the universal level should respond to contemporary challenges. A first general agreement is the interdependence of primacy and synodality at every level of the Church, and the consequent need for a synodal exercise of primacy. Very important today. A second concerns the articulation between all, some, and one. 3 complementary dimensions of the Church at each ecclesial level. The communal dimension, based on the sensus fidei of all the baptized. The collegial dimension, expressed especially in episcopal collegiality. And the personal dimension, expressed in the primatial function. Various dialogues identify the synodal dynamic inherent of the articulation of these 3 dimensions. And in reflecting on primacy, many theological dialogues have noted that these 3 dimensions, communal, collegial, and personal, operate at each of the 3 levels of the Church, local, regional, and universal. A crucial issue is the relationship between the local church and the universal church, which has important consequences for the exercise of primacy. And ecumenical dialogues have helped to bring about agreement on the simultaneity of these dimensions, insisting that it is not possible to separate the dialectical relationship between the local church and the universal church. A last point that we need to mention is the importance of the regional level advocated by both Western and Eastern partners. Western partners who call for a strengthening of the Catholic Bishops' Conferences also at continental level. Eastern partners reminded us of a model of the ancient patriarchal churches and expressed concerns about the model of unity and diversity of the churches sui juris. Orthodox insist that in a reunited church, the relationship with the Eastern churches and their bishops would have to be substantially different from the relationship now accepted with the Latin Church, and that the churches will continue to have the right and power to govern themselves according to their own traditions and disciplines. This is the dialogue with the Coptics. The principle of subsidiarity, as well as the need for a balance between primates and primacies, should be improved. Dialogues recognize that the Bishop of Rome should be granted a sufficient degree of authority to meet the many challenges and complex obligations associated with his ministry of unity.
Thank you, Monsignor Usma, for presenting the three key questions, but also for unpacking for us the conceptual notes of the document. Thank you very much. And we move now to the third presenter, presenting the fourth chapter of the document, is Reverend Professor Anthony Currer, a priest of the Diocese of Exham, Newcastle in England, where he has responsibilities for the desk of faith and mission and unity and dialogue. He has a wide theological expertise, but he has also been very much involved in receptive ecumenism, especially in his many years as chaplain at Durham University, but also for many years he has been official of the Dicastery for Christian Unity, responsible for the desk of dialogues and relations with Anglicans and Methodists. He continues to be a consultant of Archic 3, and he also is a member of the International Commission providing the liturgical text for the Week of Prayer for Christian Unity. Professor Currer, thank you.
Firstly, I'm really delighted to be invited to be here and to be able to speak, but even more delighted that I was part of this project because what I contributed to this project is minuscule compared to what I learned, particularly from my two esteemed colleagues who you just heard speaking, and that was a great benefit and blessing to my life, and I'm very, very grateful for it. I'm now a parish priest, and so parishioners, colleagues, ecumenical and Catholic, back home have seen the publicity of this event, and they've said to me, so what's it all about and why is it significant? And I found myself using the analogy that I think this document gives us a new base camp. People starting to climb Everest start off from a base camp. Well, I think this gives us a new base camp for tackling the issue of the ministry of the Bishop of Rome. I've been asked to speak about Chapter 4, some practical suggestions and requests addressed to the Catholic Church. When John Paul II in Ut Unum Sint talks about the Second Vatican Council in paragraphs 15 and 16, he emphasizes that the Council was really calling for conversion. And conversion he links to renewal and reform. And he says, by engaging in frank dialogue, communities help one another to look at themselves together in the light of the apostolic tradition. And of course, that's building on something that's already said in Unitatis Redemptio, which is that the primary duty of Catholics ecumenically is to identify what needs to be renewed in the Catholic household itself and then to pursue that renewal with vigor. And so this section of the document fits into that vision of making progress ecumenically through renewal. My own responsibilities, as Professor Rossi has said, a lot of it was to do with the Anglican Roman Catholic dialogue, primacy of the Bishop of Rome. To put this in a very colloquial, kind of British English expression, the Pope wears many hats. That's, the key idea. The German Lutheran Catholic dialogue, I think, lists them all. He's Bishop of Rome, pastor of the whole church, head of the College of Bishops, Patriarch of the West, Primate of Italy, Archbishop and Metropolitan of the Church province of Rome, Sovereign of the Vatican City. And so what that means is when the Pope does something, we have to ask, well, in what of those roles is he acting when he does this? And a key distinction that we have to recover is what the Pope is doing in his ministry of unity for the whole Church, and what does the ministry do as Patriarch of the West. And the reason that those have become so difficult to disentangle, so confused, is because of the things that have happened through history. Firstly, the tragic division between the East and the West. Secondly, the extraordinary spread of Catholicism, particularly from the early modern period onwards, spreading west and south and east. So it no longer looks very much like a patriarchate of the West. Ecumenical partners fear, when they come into dialogue with us, they fear accepting a universal ministry of unity and getting a patriarch. They don't want patriarchal powers, they want the ministry of unity. So the more that we can do in the Catholic Church to differentiate, properly differentiate the roles of the Bishop of Rome, the better, the more we have a healthy decentralization in our own church, and the more other Christians will be able to envisage how their community can become part of this communion that we represent. Third point, synodality ad intra. Bishop Bonney, who is a member of our council and was an official for a long time at the Dicastery, said, you know, Vatican II put Vatican I into a new context, and that context was the collegiality of bishops. What we're making our way through now with regard to synodality is another recontextualization of both Vatican I and Vatican II, which is to put both into the context of the synodality or conciliarity of the whole people of God. And those recontextualizations, they're important to that, that renewed interpretation of Vatican I. It's a new hermeneutical frame within which to see it. So the exercise of synodality decentralizes our church by recognizing the indispensable part that is played by the whole church in discerning the meaning of the gospel of our times, for our times, and to attend properly to the baptized, allowing their faith to be expressed in the local churches and the bishops' conferences. I've gone on too long, have I, Teresa? Okay. So, the last point, synodality ad extra. This is simply to say that various, particularly the WCC, talked about conciliar fellowship in the 1970s. And in response to the responses to Ut Unum Sint, various bodies suggested that the Pope could convoke a meeting of all Christians in something like a conciliar fellowship. It's kind of building on the great experience that we had when when John the 23rd invited other Christians to come to the Second Vatican Council. That was our first great experience of thinking together, of course, which is such an important phrase for this document. And when we think together about how we are to be church, then great ecumenical progress is made. So that's a proposal which has come about and is something of asked of us. And the second part of synodality ad extra is walking together. And walking together is about witnessing to the faith that we share in joint action and in prayer. And I was privileged to be part of Hyacinthe, which had its second plenary meeting in January of this year, and that brought together 20 pairs of bishops, Catholic and Anglican, to go back in different countries, 20 different countries where Catholics and Anglicans exist in significant number, to be advocates of the two churches, giving that joint witness, walking together in very practical terms. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Currer. A base camp. I like that expression, and I think we could adopt it almost as a refrain in our ecumenical journey, but also thank you for reminding us the role of conversion and hope. And now, the document not only provides us very interesting historical insights and theological insights. I think by now it's very clear the relevance of such a document, but it also calls for a theology in action. And so now I would ask Professor Destivelle again to present to us some concrete proposals, correct? Coming from the document, coming from the Dicastery. Thank you.
Yes, so very briefly. Actually, I would like to say also that when we were thinking about the title of this document, we were hesitating. There were many suggestions. One of the suggestions was strengthen your brothers.
I was very keen.
Yeah.
Yes.
There was, but actually I thought after it could have been also together, of course, because together, of course, is also insieme, ovviamente, or ensemble, bien sûr. There are, yes, it would have been also a possibility, or also recognized by all concerned, because it was also riconosciuti dagli uni e dagli altri. But what you have heard so far was just a synthesis of the different responses. So, as we said, about 30 responses to Ut Unum Sint and 50 documents dealing with the question of primacy and synodality. But on the basis of this synthesis, the Dicastery for Promoting Christian Unity drafted also its own proposal based on the proposals of the dialogues themselves. And this proposal is entitled Towards an Exercise of Primacy in the 21st Century. And this proposal was approved, discussed twice by the plenary assembly of the Dicastery. And this proposal contains two main parts. The first part suggests future steps for theological dialogues, and the second part offers some principles and suggestions for a renewed exercise of the ministry of unity of the Bishop of Rome. So, with regard to the first part, to the theological dialogues, after noting their contribution to reflection on primacy, the proposal of the Dicastery suggests a number of steps. First, it calls for a kind of dialogue of dialogues, in the sense that a better connection is needed between the dialogues, between local and international, between official and unofficial, between bilateral and multilateral, and particularly between Eastern and Western dialogues, so that all these dialogues may be mutually enriching, because one of the problems is the isolation of these dialogues. I am more involved in the dialogue with the Orthodox or with the Oriental Orthodox, and I'm sometimes very surprised that very few members of these dialogues know what happened in the dialogue with the Anglicans, for example, while the Anglican dialogue also has dealt with the question of primacy since the 70s. So a dialogue of dialogue. A second proposal of the document is a clarification of the vocabulary used by the dialogues. Terms such as synodality, conciliarity, collegiality, primacy, administration, and so on, are not always used consistently and coherently in the documents. The proposal then suggests the promotion of the reception of the results of these dialogues, not only through discussion between experts, but by involving the whole church, lay faithful, theologians and pastors, with the participation of theological faculties and local ecumenical commission. What we are now doing is a kind, actually this document is also a kind of reception of all this dialogue, and what we are now doing is also a reception of these dialogues. And finally, the plenary suggests that theological dialogue should not only reflect on doctrinal differences of the past, but also theologically interpret current relations between the churches, which are also a locus theologicus. The second part of this proposal deals with the different suggestions made by the documents for the exercise of primacy in our day. So the four proposals just mentioned by Professor Tony Currer are taken up by the plenary. First, a rereading and official commentary of Vatican I by the Catholic Church. Second, a clearer distinction between the different responsibilities of the Pope. And it was before the title of Patriarch of the West was reinserted in the Annuario Pontificio among the historical titles. Third, the synodality ad intra of the Catholic Church. And in this regard, the plenary notes that many of the synodal institution and practice of the Eastern Catholic Church, I'm very happy and honored that the secretary of the Dicastery for Eastern Churches is here, because many of actually of the practices and institutions of these Eastern Catholic churches could inspire the Latin Church. As well as in a spirit of gift, the synodal institutions and practices of other Christian communions, which could be systematically identified for this purpose, as it was started here in this university, in the Listening to the East and Listening to the West conferences organized at the Angelicum. At the local and regional level, the document invites, to the plenary assembly of the Dicastery invites also to reflect on the ecclesial significance of continental episcopal bodies in connection with the suggestion to create major churches or even new patriarchate, as Cardinal Ratzinger once suggested in the 70s. At the universal level, it invites to reflect on the significance of the Council of Cardinals, the G9, and on the possibility of a permanent synod to assist the Pope in the central and daily government of the Church. And the final proposal, mentioned also by Professor Currer, concerns the synodality ad extra of the Catholic Church, promoting regular meetings between representatives of the churches at world level, indicated as a promising means of making visible and deepening the communion already shared. The proposal concludes with a few suggestions for a model of communion. Such model of communion would be realized differently in the East and in the West. In the case of the Orthodox churches, this model could be aligned with Cardinal Ratzinger's oft-quoted principle that, I quote, "Rome must not demand of the East more than has been formulated and experienced in the first millennium." This model could include two responsibilities identified by the dialogues relating to the ministry of unity of the Bishop of Rome, namely, first, a specific role in ecumenical council, the famous synergia mentioned by the Second Ecumenical Council, Nicene II in 787, and second, a role of mediation in the event of conflicts through the synodal exercise of the procedure of appeal as it was foreseen by the Council of Sardica. As far as the Western Christian communions are concerned, many of the dialogue, as we have seen, recognize the need for a primacy of the whole church, and in order to promote Christian unity and mission. The dialogues with the Western Christian communions offer important insights and perspectives for an accepted exercise of a ministry of unity by the Bishop of Rome, a primacy of proclamation and witness, kerygma, martyria, which could be received by other Christians even before the restoration of full communion. A primacy ultimately be modeled on diaconia, so kerygma, martyria, diaconia. Primacy must be rooted in the mystery of the cross and modeled on the kenotic example of Christ.
Thank you very much. Our heartfelt gratitude and thanks to the speakers, also for their direct involvement in the drafting of the document. So I would say really thank you from all of us. And now we are eager to listen to the perspectives of the other Christian traditions. First of all, the Anglican tradition. Professor Reverend Jamie Hawkey, canon theologian of Westminster Abbey, chair of the Westminster Abbey Institute, personal chaplain to His Majesty King Charles III. Professor Hawkey is visiting professor in many prestigious universities and academics. I just mentioned King's College. And also he has a long list of commitments and official roles. I will just mention the member of International Reformed Anglican Dialogue, member of the Church of England's Faith and Order Commission, of the Church of England Estates Theological Group, advisor of the Center for Empathy in International Affairs, and member of the Editorial Advisory Board for the International Journal for the Study of Christian Church. Professor Hawkey.
Grazie, Professoressa Rossi. And thank you to all friends for the honor of my honor it is to be here. And on behalf of your guests, can I say what an extraordinary gift this document and the research behind it is already to the wider church. This is an example of what the Bishop and See of Rome can do for the whole church, so thank you. It's also an honor to be in the Angelicum, where I was an exchange student 17 years ago. One of my professors was Professor Robert Christian, God rest him, who is, I'm sure, even now cheering us on as he participates in the beatific vision. When St. John Paul II visited Canterbury Cathedral in 1982, his homily on that occasion contained the following lines. On this first visit of a pope to Canterbury, I come to you in love, the love of Peter, to whom the Lord said, I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail, and when you have turned again, strengthen your brethren. Just as every minister of the gospel must do, so today I echo the words of the Master, I am among you as one who serves. With me, I bring to you the hopes and desires, the prayers and goodwill of all united with the Church of Rome, which from the earliest times was said to preside in love. End quote. 13 years before Ut Unum Sint, Pope John Paul set out in that homily in a distilled form much of what he subsequently expanded upon in the encyclical, and described much of what Anglicans hope for in a refreshed exercise of the Petrine office at the service of the whole church. Prayer and the gifts of strength and encouragement, service among the wider apostolic college and within the communion of the church, an emphasis on cum petro, and a sense that the presidency of the bishop and see of Rome is one of love. In language used by the 1999 agreed statement of Archic, the gift of authority, this is a gift to be received by all the churches, a universal primacy exercised collegially in the context of synodality is integral to episcopae at the service of universal communion. Much has changed in both our communions since 1999. Our ecclesial cultures have become more complex and more diverse. The Anglican communion has explored a formal communion covenant, and there have been other attempts to strengthen the structures which support our bonds of affection. We watch with admiration and deep interest the wonderful synodal journey, which is now so fundamental to the Catholic Church's discernment under Pope Francis. In terms of changed contexts, it is just worth noting that the word synodality does not actually explicitly appear in Ut Unum Sint. And yet, the development of our thinking on primacy within the wider context of synodality is one of the most notable features of the study document released today. What is set before us is what the gift of authority envisaged and endorsed, namely a ministry exercised in collegiality and synodality, assisting the Church to be the authentically Catholic koinonia in which unity does not curtail diversity. The generosity and breadth of John Paul's invitation in Ut Unum Sint remains a sign of the possibilities inherent in the Petrine ministry. I want to highlight a few details from that encyclical which sets a particularly rich theological scene. Firstly, in the introduction, the first image Pope John Paul gives for the Petrine ministry is that same one he used in Canterbury Cathedral. When you have turned again, strengthen your brethren. This ministry of encouragement and strength offered by the Bishop of Rome operates on those three levels, personal, collegial, and communal. It is a ministry which belongs to the center of the Church's communion for the health of a fractured whole. It reveals a ministry of care at the service of the Church's life, a structure within the Church which nurtures the Church's faith and tends its wounds. Secondly, Ut Unum Sint describes papal visits to different churches as, quote, a specific responsibility in carrying out the role of the Bishop of Rome. Amongst these occasions, he includes his prayer at Canterbury Cathedral and visits to the Fanar and so on. But in a very engaging phrase, he reflects that each of these ecumenical events have their own special eloquence and, quote, have become part of the Church's memory. Whilst in ecumenical contexts, the healing or purification of memories is a necessary process, it's important to note that there are already profound and fruitful memories of liturgical togetherness, which are themselves fresh wellsprings of communion. Point 3, the encyclical reminds us that mutual recognition of baptism is a major matter. It constitutes, and I quote, a basic ecclesiological statement. It is oriented towards a complete profession of faith. And although our churches do not yet agree on the precise implications of this for Eucharistic sharing, baptism clearly provides a fruitful seedbed in which new practices of synodality and primacy can grow. There is much more work to be done here, if indeed baptism is a primary sharing in the death and resurrection of the Lord. Point 4, using a phrase particularly important in Anglican writing of the 17th century about the episcopal office, Pope John Paul particularly highlights the role of the Bishop of Rome as episcopane, watchman, sentinel. In this we sense a prophetic responsibility for discerning the signs of the times as he keeps watch over the whole. In its introduction, today's document roots the fresh development of thinking on primacy in the methodology of the Second Vatican Council. In quoting John Paul's commitment of openness to a new situation, we may be reminded of Pope Francis's recent analysis of the role of theology as he expressed it in the Motu Proprio ad Theologiam Promovendam last November, and I quote him, "Theological reflection is therefore called to a turning point, to a paradigm shift, to a courageous cultural revolution that commits it first and foremost to be a fundamentally contextual theology, capable of reading and interpreting the gospel in the conditions in which men and women daily live." So we cannot talk meaningfully about primacy without interrogating wider questions about culture, about models of leadership, and about how the church might serve the world. The new document's repeated articulation of ministry as service is not only helpful ecumenically, it also helps to interrogate other models of leadership in contemporary politics and society. If the church is the sign and servant of God's design for the world, our theological analysis of these themes cannot be unrelated to such wider questions. Today's document reports diverse reflections and conversations around the ministry of the Bishop of Rome. It is a real vademecum for the journey ahead. Section 1 gives us this excellent brief distillation of Hawkey's work, and towards the end of this section, we're told that theological reflection on primacy should also reflect on the present life of our churches, their internal developments. So how each of our churches thinks about and practices primacy ad intra is essential. For Anglicans, this will be linked to our other instruments of communion and how these might be encountered symphonically in the life of a global church. The closing paragraph of this first section includes a plea for a rapprochement of theology and practice, the dialogue of doctrine relating to the dialogue of life. Primacy is, after all, and needs to be, incarnated in a series of practices. One meeting to which the document doesn't refer, and it couldn't have done because the meeting hadn't happened, was the audience Pope Francis gave to the primates of the Anglican Communion this May. In his address, the Holy Father spoke of disagreements in the earliest years of the Church. I quote him, "often born of the frailty of the disciples or different approaches to the relationship with past tradition," end quote. Yet the narrative as a whole, the Holy Father continues, makes clear that the true protagonist, and I quote him, is the Holy Spirit. The apostles come to mutual understanding and solutions by leaving the primacy to him. The primacy of the Paraclete is a very important image to take forward. In passing, I should note that there are, of course, implications here for Trinitarian theology, not least as regards what we might think of as the monarchy of the Father, which can't be explored today, but which may be fruitful in the future. Section 2 presents 4 fundamental questions. It takes Archic's interrogation of the Petrine texts, Peter's place within the Apostolic College, having been a subject of great importance for the Anglican polemicists of the early modern period. Whilst the question of whether the primacy of the Pope was instituted de jure divino is clearly a concern of Vatican I, related debates, of course, reach back many centuries. Anglicans would want to highlight the interrelationship between episcopacy and episcopare when discussing the esse and bene esse of the Church when it comes to the sacrament of order. Anglicans refused to unchurch non-episcopal churches in the early modern period, and our own ecumenical commitments to churches not currently in the historic succession do not lessen Anglicanism's own insistence on episcopacy, nor our willingness to share the historic succession with those churches which wish to receive it. But canonical language and categories of reality and validity need to be further integrated within a wider theology of communion, not least for ecumenical consistency. Whilst on several occasions in today's document, models of communion in the first millennium are mentioned approvingly, although preserving the special character of the patristic period, Anglicans and others would want to look well beyond the first millennium for insights into these questions, including the subsequent development of Orthodox, Anglican, and Protestant theology, and the significant theological voices of those fathers of Vatican I who refused to endorse the dogmatic definitions. Historical context is important, of course, particularly when examining the First Vatican Council, but explaining is not the same as excusing. Anglicans would want to gently assert, with Article 21 of the 39 Articles, that councils can, and sometimes do, make mistakes. In setting out perspectives for a ministry of unity, Section 3 of this new document offers a synthesis of arguments and criteria. I just refer to 3. Firstly, primacy and synodality need to operate at every level of the Church because the interdependence of the assembly and the ministry constitute a dynamic mark of the Church. 2, the document refers to a pragmatic argument for ministry at a universal level. It's important to note, I think, that this question is not just pragmatic. How do we signify oneness in a fast-changing world? What kind of primacy of love does the wider world need from the Church? These are all deeply theological questions, not least because they reveal something about God's mission in the Son, the firstborn of all creation, in whom all things hold together. Thirdly, some elements from the first millennium do, of course, draw our attention to how primacy might be exercised now. The document notes how expressions of communion were not primarily juridical, nor was there one common understanding of the synagogia of the Bishop of Rome. So it might help us to think of a refreshed universal ministry which is principally charismatic rather than canonical, and rooted fundamentally in the priestly dignity of a common baptism. This consideration might help us move into the final section. How do we imagine the operation of a universal charismatic primacy even before the churches enjoy full Eucharistic communion? We need to pay much more theological attention to the ecclesial present of one another's lives, because that is where the Holy Spirit is at work amongst the whole people of God in diverse ways. In due course, we would need to look again together at structures. It is a challenge to make an ongoing commitment to subsidiarity and what the Church of Sweden spoke of as ongoing decentralization, whilst articulating a primacy that has canonical elements. But for now, a charismatic primacy of the Bishop and See of Rome could do this. There might be an interim period which would allow the necessary mechanisms to emerge. A permanent body of our churches could be mandated to consider these questions without pressure. In fact, the final chapter and summary document we have before us today helps us with this. In many ways, a differentiated exercise of the primacy of the Bishop of Rome has already been exercised de facto for some years, through visits, joint blessings, papal convening of meetings of church leaders, ecumenical participation in ad limina, the teaching address given to the primates of the Anglican Communion in May. We are already seeing a charismatic ministry of love which serves the gift of communion at work at a universal level. We need to name it as such and celebrate it. At the same time, each church should work on its own theological practices with a sense of ascesis, consciously considering how our own models might feed into and receive from the other. The Dicastery's proposal document offers some very important concluding thoughts. In a global Christian community where fragmentation and the dominance of different ideologies can seem to proliferate, there is a major opportunity for a generous, universal ministry at the service of communion differently realized. The dialogues of truth, love, and faith, and the theology and action spoken of by Pope Francis, are all underpinned not only by our profound level of theological agreement on first-order issues, but by the rich ecclesiology of symbols and practice. To conclude, one of the most important proposals concerns the development of a synodality ad extra, without waiting for full visible communion. To insist that all ad limina visits always included leaders of other churches would be one mechanism for this. Another would be to consider expanding the Council of Cardinals to include other church leaders, perhaps on a rota basis. A further, even richer possibility would be to open an ecumenical dimension to the College of Cardinals itself, in which leaders of other churches took part in all pre-conclave discussions in the days prior to a papal election, whether or not they were actually electors themselves. These ecumenical cardinals could also potentially serve on appropriate Roman dicasteries, linking the wider Roman Curia into this particular universal facet of the ministry of the Bishop of Rome, opening up the principle of ecumenical synodality on another rich level. I'm sorry, I think I probably have gone over by 2 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for weaving together the motivational and the theological aspects, the dogmatic and the charismatic perspectives. And now, of course, the Orthodox perspective is what we want to hear to conclude this reflection. Professor Dimitrios Keramidas is professor of Orthodox theology in this university, but he collaborates also with many other universities in Italy and Greece. He's co-chair of the Ecumenical Dialogue Group of the International Orthodox Theological Association, member of the Center of Ecumenical Missiological and Environmental Studies, Metropolitan Panteleimon Papageorgiou of Thessaloniki, and member of the Italian Association of Ecumenists. Professor Keramidas, thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. So I will try to limit myself in the context that was given to me. So the Dicastery's new study document, the Bishop of Rome, has, first of all, the merit of being an honest document in both its content and purpose. In fact, the document is not intended to convince non-Catholics of the Roman idea of the authority of the Bishop of Rome. On the contrary, the document's purpose is to receive the assertions made by ecumenical dialogues related to the Roman primacy, its nature, and specifically its function in the context of the reunited Church. This is a central aspect to the document, as it seeks to listen to different Christian perspectives on the matter of primacy and learn from them in order to address ways through which the papal ministry will not hinder the promotion of Christian unity. Secondly, the document provides its recipients, whether Catholics or not, with an understanding of how primacy and primacies, in the plural, are perceived and exercised in the churches of the East and the West. This also is essential for the ecumenical re-evaluation of the ministry of the Bishop of Rome and its implementation in the worldwide Christian family for the sake of its unity. I think this perspective is central to the document. Finally, the document should be praised for the method used in its drafting. In fact, the document incorporates views from Catholic theologians, Roman dicasteries, non-Catholic experts, and has received also papal approval. This method could serve as an example for similar discussions and processes in other churches, of course, including my own church, which is facing similar challenges. History and recent experience have shown that churches are not closed box, but interact with each other. And what happens in a specific church may have an impact, positive or negative, on the life of the other churches and on the ecumenical journey itself. So there are these three central aspects. It's synodical method, its ecumenical intention, and its purpose to listen to and learn from the others. So in what particular way the idea of primacy is projected by the Orthodox? Let me refer and limit myself here to the official Orthodox Catholic dialogues, in the context of which the Orthodox Church has recognized that, first, primacy at the universal level is accepted by both East and West. Second, primacy at all levels of church life and government, local, regional, or eparchial, and universal, is a practice rooted in the canonical tradition of the Church. Third, there are differences in the understanding of the manner in which primacy is to be exercised and of its scriptural and theological foundations. Fourth, the Orthodox acknowledge that primacy includes the authority to make decisions, which perhaps is different from taking decisions, meaning that primacy does not mean jurisdiction or imposing the will of the one over the others, but assuring fidelity to the common apostolic tradition and faith. In any case, the Orthodox prefer to speak of the primacy of honor, even though the exact extent and prerogatives of such honors are variously interpreted among the Orthodox. The document quotes the words of Ecumenical Patriarch Athenagoras that, I quote, "Rome is the see which is the first in honor and order in the living body of the Christian churches scattered throughout the world." It can't be deduced from these words that it is possible to integrate the primacy of honor of the Bishop of Rome into the communion among the churches. This inevitably involves synodality and other regional primacies. In fact, the document notes that most of the dialogues agree on that primacy should be exercised in an authentic synodal manner. This leads us to another challenge, that is a new synodal exercise of primacy. For example, one can ask whether the Apostolic Canon 34, already quoted and cited in the document, a canon which describes in the view of many, an authentic interdependence between regional primacy and synodality could, and I quote the document, could serve as a model for the universal church. The document comments that, I quote, "Many of the dialogues have observed that the regional level is the most relevant for the exercise of primacy and that there is a need, I quote, for a balance between the exercise of primacy on the regional level and the exercise of primacy on the universal level." Does this balance mean to extend the deliberative authority of regional councils, as it is in the Orthodox Church, to the universal or ecumenical level? A possible way to address this issue would be to adopt the ancient first millennium common canonical provisions, including, of course, Apostolic Canon 34. Orthodox canonist Vlasios Fidas, among others, believes that the primacy of the Bishop of Rome must return to the canonical and ecclesiological conditions in force in the first millennium. For thus, there is no room for a twofold, so to speak, interpretation of the papal prerogative, one within the Catholic Church and one beyond the Catholic Church. Yet, this view has some limits. For example, for the late Metropolitan John Zizioulas, to return to the situation of the first millennium is unrealistic because, Zizioulas says, and I quote, the Roman Catholic Church would not be prepared to eliminate her second millennium from history in order to unite with the Orthodox. For Zizioulas, neither regarding the differences between the Orthodox and the Catholics on the subject of primacy as parallel or complementary is realistic, as this would mean, and I quote, that the Pope would have to renounce in practice his claims of universal jurisdiction, limiting it only to the West or to his own folk. So what is the document's view on this last point? The document recalls the US Orthodox Catholic dialogue, which has noted that the Bishop of Rome's relationship to the Eastern churches and their bishops can be, I quote, substantially different from the relationship now accepted in the Latin Church. This is a perspective that, as we saw, Zizioulas did not exclude. This is based on the fact that the Pope historically and pragmatically has acted simultaneously, as mentioned, as a bishop of a local diocese, the Church of Rome, primate of the Western or Latin Church, and minister of unity at the universal level. Some dialogues, the document notes, have called for a clearer distinction between the Pope's patriarchal and primarchal ministry, and also for a clear differentiation of roles in line with the distinct nature and relationship of primacy and synodality at its ecclesial level, local, regional, and universal. This perhaps might open the direction towards providing regional councils with deliberative authority, the real problem of the Orthodox Catholic dialogue, according to Zizioulas. In fact, the document envisages that, I quote, the different responsibilities of the Bishop of Rome, especially between his patriarchal ministry in the Church of the West and in his primarchal ministry of the Communion of Churches, mean to consider how other churches might relate to the Bishop of Rome as primate while having a certain autonomy themselves. So in this perspective, the document addresses the concept of conciliar fellowship as a means of achieving unity and not just as an ecumenical goal, as a goal of ecumenical movement. Such fellowship can be realized within the framework of what is being called in the document external synodality, a very interesting idea in my opinion, including common structures, initiatives of synodal type, consultations, meeting, and common witness. Another method of achieving this exercise of primacy while keeping certain autonomy among the other churches might be the diversity of ecclesial models recalled in the document paragraph 107. I quote, the early church had a diversity of ecclesial organizational models responding to local customs and needs. A certain diversity is not only to be expected in church life, but should be welcomed as healthy, and perhaps the ecumenical model of differentiated consensus is of service. Now, furthermore, the section Principles for the Exercise of the Primacy in the 21st Century frames a possible exercise of the Petrine ministry in a wider ecclesiological and ecumenical perspective. These principles include, among many others, first, the interdependency of primacy and synodality at each level of the church. Secondly, the articulation between all, some, and one at each ecclesial level, local, regional, and universal. It also notes that the Roman primacy is not a power exercised universally, but an authority in service to the communion between the churches and to the whole church, the Ecclesia Universa. This can be achieved through the establishment of permanent synodal governing structures, already mentioned, at the level of the entire church, with the active participation of local bishops at the model of the permanent synod, synodos endymusa, and with the task of assisting people with the governance of the church. And finally, there is the issue of the Patriarch of the West, recently restored or reappeared in the Pontifical Annual Directory. I will now conclude. How, in light of all this, or is it possible to have a differentiated exercise of papal primacy, respecting the criterion of shared responsibilities in the universal guidance of the Church? One could recall the fact that during the pre-schism, so to speak, era, the position of the Bishop of Rome in the worldwide communion was that of the Patriarch of West, meaning that the Pope exercised his regional primatial prerogatives in the West, and that this precedence or honor did not compromise neither the administrative autonomy of the Eastern churches, of the Eastern patriarchates, nor the authority, the normative authority of the ecumenical councils. Today, the ecumenical process needs to deal realistically with new structures established during the centuries of division in the West and the East, especially today, where the Catholic Church is not exclusively Western, as has been already said, and the Orthodox Church is not exclusively Eastern. This creates the necessity of a shared concern for the guidance of the one Christian family, both in the East and the West, and this guidance should be a shared responsibility. Now, commenting on the papal encyclical Ut Unum Sint, the French theologian Olivier Clément expressed his hope in the late 90s for the Orthodox Catholic unity in the following manner, I quote. The hope, Clement writes, the hope is that Rome can return to the authentic conception of the primacy as a service of communion, in a real interdependence of its bishop with all the others, and through an equal and real dialogue with all the people of God, so the one, the many, and the all. This fact, Clement continues, will imply its reconciliation as sister church to sister church without any jurisdictional claim with the Orthodox Church. I believe that Clement would be pleased to find many of his aspirations confirmed in the Dicastery's new document, which can be considered as a prophetic expression of the concern, of our common concern, for the goal that all be one as God is one. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Keramidas, for deepening the conceptual framework of the Orthodox perspective, but also for your mention about the method of the document, which certainly is a key aspect. And now, the floor is yours. We have about, between 15 minutes, 20 minutes for your questions, comments, remarks. You can address all the speakers or one in particular. Please. And if you have a question, you may also just come here and use that microphone. And even if you have already your question in mind, you can come closer and, so that the process will be fast.
Hi, Father Gamberi, a Jesuit. Thank you, everybody. And I was really taken by the image of the base camp, okay, to climb to the Everest. But if you want to climb to the Everest, you need a very light backpack. And so for dealing with the question of primacy, you really need to discern what is still essential. I really like your image of charismatic. I would say like a light primacy, which has the depth of the ministry, but not entanglement or the heaviness of everything else, which is, and here is my very precise question, it's not only a matter of exercise, has to do also with the essence. That means, how can we understand, once again, the context of the 21st century through the receptions, okay, ecumenical reception we had in the dialogues, even the essence of the primacy. So this is my question. A light primacy and a charismatic one, yeah.
I think the post is
The base camp was your idea.
Yes.
So let's go this way, the charismatic
I think the base camp is a wonderful image. It's a wonderful image. And I think you're right. In order to climb to Everest, you need to have a light backpack. But you also have to have very well-honed muscles. One can stretch this image too far. But I think, you know, the maturity of the dialogues, multiple theological dialogues, gives us some rather strong muscles with which to work. I think one of the reasons why I'm attracted to this sense of a charismatic primacy is that it does allow for, potentially, a sense of pneumatological energy to it. I think if we try and sit down, even with extraordinary documents like this and the insights of the last 60, 70 years, and plan how this is going to work, I suspect it either won't work or it'll only work for some. I feel that if we can have this charismatic sense of a primacy of love, which is allowed to develop without undue pressure, then we might actually find ourselves in the sort of operative space where one can add canonical norms. I don't know. I do absolutely take the point that's often made that it's a false dichotomy to set up law and gospel against each other. Of course, that's right. But I think if we go in with a sort of premeditated series of ingredients, a kind of hit list of what we have to do to make this work, it's unlikely to be the gift that the Lord wants to give us.
Thank you for your question. Yeah, I think... and it's an interesting addition to the image of the backpack. It seems to me that and one of the things which I liked about, you know, which I think is important about chapter 4 is that it puts the emphasis on growth and reform and renewal as the way in which we're going to move towards an ecumenical consensus. You know, I was very involved in receptive ecumenism, and when we did the Walking Together, the Walking Together on the Way, the first document of Hawkey 3, it adopted that method of receptive ecumenism. What can we learn from one another? And I suppose, and that's very much a renewal and reform model. It picks up all of those things that I was talking about from Unitatis Redintegratio and from Ut Unum Sint. And I suppose I couldn't help thinking, I remember talking in a canon law ecumenical discussion between Anglicans and Catholics, and I tried to express what I thought was what the Pope was doing when he was acting authoritatively. And one Catholic, which really surprised me, I probably shouldn't admit this, but said, "Oh, I think that's conciliarism." And I suppose some of the heaviness in our backpack is some of the history that we carry. And, you know, you can always be accused of making a false move, which makes us wary of you know, making progress on this. And I think we need to be brave enough to, in our dialogue with our dialogue partners, to shed some of the heavy stuff that we've been carrying that we don't actually need to get down to the essence that you're talking about. Yes, I like that. Thank you.
Other questions or remarks? Please, Archbishop.
Actually, I have several questions, but Mainly it's to Father Destivelle. First of all, when I received this invitation, so I saw the Bishop of Rome. So it's too much. I think I was waiting for a study of 600, 700 pages. So I was surprised a little bit to see that it's a document. It's a document about synthesis, maybe, about the last comments or maybe our interpretation of Ut Unum Sunt. I think, as a title, it's too much. I think this one. Two, what is the occasion of this document now? Now, the Church in Rome, especially, we are talking a lot and especially about synodality. What is the purpose of this document now? And what is its importance? Is it important in the ecumenical dialogues, maybe, with the Orthodox? Or it is a synthesis and it's time maybe to see what we think about the primacy? And third, you talked a little bit about the reinsertion of the Patriarch of the West. When it was eliminated, this from the Annuario Pontificio, we read a note from the Dicastery of the Promotion for Christian Unity. Now we inserted in a certain way that we didn't know. So we heard about this, and then we went to see the Annuario Pontificio, and we found it. We didn't hear or we didn't read any note. Is it on purpose? And what is the purpose? We eliminate this title and we insert it again in the Annuario Pontificio, and we didn't know why. So I think maybe it's too much.
No,
you cannot respond to all of the questions, but I think.
Thank you very much, Archbishop Jalach. Professor Destivelle, you were the main addressee to this long series of complex questions.
Yes, thank you, Sayedna, for your questions. Well, regarding the title, yes, as I said, we hesitated between various possibilities, but the most important is the subtitle, I think, yes, a synthesis, a primacy and synodality in the ecumenical dialogues and in the responses to the encyclical Ut Unum Sint. Actually, the occasion of this document was the anniversary of Ut Unum Sint. Yes, it was in 2020, the 25th anniversary, and we started, it was during the pandemic, remember, so we were in smart working, reflecting upon what we will do during this time. The office was closed. So we started to think on this occasion of the 25th anniversary, and also being not able to deal with our usual dialogues, to deepen to harvest the fruits of Ut Unum Sint, what has been said, what has been responded to Ut Unum Sint, and progressively we extended this study to the various ecumenical dialogues. And we discovered that actually about 50 documents dealt with this question. Not only the Anglican, not only the Orthodox, but the Lutheran. Actually, there is very interesting Catholic Lutheran document dialogues in the US, for example, or in France, the Groupe des Dombes. And actually, we discovered many documents. So it was, the occasion was really the anniversary of Ut Unum Sint, and after the synod on synodality was convoked, and one of the topic of this synod is also primacy. Especially now, yes, there are the synodal shaping of the church at the local, regional, and universal level, and the question of primacy is one of the topics which will be dealt with in next October during the synod. Regarding your second question, so it was about the the Patriarchate of the West. Yes, this question was asked also raised this morning, and Cardinal Koch was embarrassed because he said, we didn't know why it was removed in 2006, and we don't know really why it has been reinserted now 1 month ago. So the Pope Benedict XVI and Pope Francis did not explain themselves why their decision. So Cardinal Kasper at that time tried to explain and as Cardinal Koch said this morning, it was he was reflecting upon these gestures of both Pope Benedict and Pope Francis. It was for both has ecumenical intention, yes, but we should distinguish the question of the Patriarchate and the question of the West. Because the question of the Patriarchate is, of course, important for ecumenical reason. The question of the West is also is important, perhaps more important for interreligious dialogue. Yes, that the Bishop of Rome will not be only associated with the West, with the Western world. But actually it is true, as Cardinal Cordy said this morning, that most of the Catholics now are in the East, but we can say also that most of the Eastern Christians are in the West. So it's difficult really to answer, to know why Pope Benedict and Pope Francis decided to this removal and this reinsertion, but what we can say is that it is a good opportunity to think about the distinction between the different functions of the Pope as Patriarch and as Primate at the service of the communion between the churches. And your last question was about
the weight
the importance of
today.
This document? Is it an official document of the Holy See, or it's a document of studies, or a synthesis of all what has been said during these 25 years?
It is clearly not a magisterial document. It is a study document. It is a study, as it is, a study document of the Dicastery for Promoting Christian Unity. So it's not a teaching document. It is a synthesis of what has been said in the different official and non-official dialogues. So with a proposal at the end of the Dicastery. Of course, this document is published with the approval of Pope Francis, so it has a certain weight, but it's not a cheat, it's just to encourage us to continue the discussion.
May I just add to that? There is a passage in the Ecumenical Directory who says that all the ecumenical documents are published under the authority of their authors, but they are binding insofar as they are saying the truth. So I think it is important for all of us to look at the text and to study the text and to evaluate the text as for the truth is in the text or not. I'm happy that you said that you were waiting for 600 pages. I'm happy that the students here will realize that this is a good, but it's short document in which we try to, at least, try to synthesize not only what has been said, but what are the topics around the Bishop of Rome as such. It is interesting, one image about the first question is when Pope Paul VI went to the World Council of Churches, the first word was, "My name is Peter." At times, we need to understand what does it mean, Peter. And the Patrinity has been given to us, not by the Anglicans, I know that you did a lot, but by the Lutherans. So there are a lot of elements that we need to recover on the sign of truth. And I think that's important as ecumenical. We are not having the authority, but the authority of the truth that is in there.
We had announced 6:30 as the end of the meeting, and it's 6:29, so I am afraid that we have to stop this conversation here, but I would like once again to thank all our distinguished guest speakers, the Dicastery for Promoting Christian Unity, the Ecumenical Institute of the Angelicum, and I'm sure that we return to our ecumenical and theological commitments with a renewed commitment and motivations to our ecumenical journey. Pope Francis in Fratres Omnes says that to the process of globalization is lacking the prophetic and spiritual contribution of Christian unity. This afternoon, I believe we had new motivation to contribute to ecumenism, theologically, spiritually, and prophetically. Thank you very much, all of you, for your participation.
Thank you, Teresa. Keeping us all in line. Make sure to have you reserved.